In this video, I'm going to be building the 1/35th scale Lancia 1ZM Italian First World War armoured car from Copper State Models. I'm James and welcome back to LPJ Models. Because we've already looked at loads of sprue shots from Copper State Models in the past, we're just going to crack straight on with the build. In my usual fashion, the parts were removed from their sprues with my God Hand single blade sprue cutters. And like we've come to see with many of Copper State's armoured cars, the construction starts in the engine. These are usually nicely detailed affairs that could benefit from a little bit of wiring, but out of the box they're pretty good. And before I forget, all the parts are being glued with VMS fast setting styrene cement. Once the main engine construction was done, it was time to work on the chassis. This is provided in a multi-part construction that assembles a bit like a ladder. But because of the large positive location tabs, there's very little chance this will end up wonky. When assembling something like this, I could always do with an extra pair of hands, but everything clicked in nicely in the end. Eventually. It is possible to do this step without adding the engine, because it'd be really hard to paint the engine in metallics and the chassis frame in the green. You know, without making a complete mess or doing tons of masking. So leaving the radiator and the engine out at this stage is a very viable option. The rear suspension leaf springs were then glued into place. These are nicely detailed, but they do require a little bit of cleanup. These kits are usually really nicely engineered, so I won't go too in depth with the construction on this build. With the main frame of the chassis and the engine build up, it's already time to start painting. First up, the engine block was given a layer of Mr. Colour GX2 Gloss Black. This was thinned with about 70% Mr. Levelling Thinner. When using GX2, I usually spray down one moderate coat of paint. I then follow this up with an extra thin, 90% thinner layer of GX2, just to smooth down the paint to make sure it's extra smooth and shiny. The lower part of the engine was then given a layer of Alclad aluminium. Because these paints are so thin, I'm spraying it around 12-ish psi. Next up, I'm going to spray the radiator with the SMS brass that I reviewed in my last video. I wasn't overly enamoured with how this paint sprayed particularly, but I did get a reply from Scott, the owner of SMS Paints, on my YouTube channel. In the top left corner of the video, you can see his response. It's nice to see a positive reaction from a model company, so big props to Scott for reaching out and letting me know what's going on with the paint. Anyway, once the brass was sprayed, I painted the radiator grille with AK 3rd Gen Smoke Black. This took a few layers to build up to opacity and I had to be really careful not to get any on the brass. Next up, the chassis frame assembly was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Grey. This was thinned around 30% primer to 70% Mr. Levelling Thinner. And once that was dry, the whole frame assembly was painted with SMS Dark Green G4. This was again thinned around 70-30 with Mr. Levelling Thinner. The paint went down really smoothly and covered really well, as we saw in the review video. With all the base colour work done on the chassis and the engine, it was time to do some detail painting. This was started with some pipework painted with Vallejo brass. The spark plugs were picked out with Dark Star Silver. This colour always requires a few coats, but it comes out really nice once it's finished. I'm also using here what has to be one of the world's smallest brushes. This is an Isabey 229-20 Kolinsky Sable, and I kid you not, the bristle length is around 2.5mm. It's not one of the most practical brushes, but now and again it does have its uses. With the detail painting complete, let's get that engine mounted into the chassis. This is a bit tricky as you do have to splay out the front suspension arms before slotting the engine in. And it is a bit of a brute force approach, but it does save a lot of hassle. I did also add some cheeky spark plug wires made with 0.2mm lead wire. but stupidly I didn't film it. Right, with the lower surfaces complete, let's work on the fighting compartment. First up, the firewall/control panel was added to the lower floor thing, and then the steering pillar and the seat was added. There really isn't a lot to glue at this stage, so it's great for a lazy modeler like me. The floor was then primed and painted with a dark black brown. I'm going to scuff the floor up with some Humbrol chipping and scratching agent. In retrospect, you don't really see it, so it was a bit of a waste of time, but it's a cool thing to do anyway. Once the Humbrol chipping fluid was dry, the whole floor was given a layer of SMS Camo Black. This was thinned about 60 thinner 40 paint. And once this was dry, yep, you guessed it, I used some warm water and an old tatty brush to remove some of the paint away. For a lacquer paint, the SMS came away surprisingly easily and potentially in flakes that were a little bit too large, so I'll need to experiment a bit more with those in the future. I painted the seats with a worn distressed leather look. This was started with a layer of Vallejo mahogany, and then followed with some chips, leather distressing, using a sponge and a light tan Vallejo colour. If you want to explore this technique in depth, I have got a tutorial called How to Paint Realistic Leather on Your Models. And if you want to see it, there's a link in the video description. Once the acrylic was dry, I painted over some Artist Oil Burnt Umber. This was thinned with VMS Oil Expert to help speed up the drying time. It was then blended in with a soft brush. I then used a grime oil brusher to add some dirt in some of the crevices on the floor. This was lightly thinned with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier and brushed roughly where I wanted it to go, and when it started drying, once again I blended it in with a soft brush. You may have seen me use this brush many times, and just in case you're curious, this is a ProArt Terry Harrison soft blender. Now, this specific armoured car served in Libya in 1931, and because of this I'm going to add some sandy dirt to the floor. To do this I used one of the VMS coarse sand pigments. This was then thinned with the VMS alkyd binder, just to make it stick a bit better. Unlike with the grime oil brusher, this was painted in areas that I'd expected sand and dirt to accumulate. And after I'd left enough time for some of the solvent to evaporate, around 20 minutes, I once again used my soft blender brush just to blend it in. The nice thing about these coarse pigments is, they're coarser, so they do look like more of a deposit than a dust, which works great for places like this where sand is going to build up in the cracks. And a floor wouldn't be a floor without some grimy spillage. I used Abteilung 502 engine grease, slightly thinned, and then speckled this all over the floor. I also used this same mix to add some more concentrated stains. And with the floor done, it was time to marry this to the chassis. I had to scrape off a fair amount of paint to make sure the bond was strong. And before moving any further, I added a sandy wash to the engine. The Libyan version of the armoured car doesn't have the large bulky fenders for the rear wheels, so the attachment point needs to be filled in and the mounting brackets need to be removed. To fill in the hole, I cut off a square of sheet styrene and popped it into place. The remaining small gaps were then filled with sprue glue and left to dry, before sanding it all down smooth. Tackling the brackets was much simpler. Firstly, I cut away the majority of the raised detail. And after a light sanding, I realised there was still some visible, so this was gently scraped away, using very little pressure on the knife. Once I was satisfied, the whole area was sanded smooth. Great success! Next up, it's time to paint the walls of the fighting compartment. This was primed and then pre-shaded with like a RLMO2 colour, but it was a waste of time, so I'm just going to say I sprayed the interior with SMS white. The fighting compartment was separated with two colours, white at the top, black at the bottom. So once the white was dry, I masked this off and then sprayed the black. Cool, let's do some weathering. First up, I sponge chipped some of the high wear areas of the interior with VMS Chip & Nick CN04. This is a dark blacky brown grey colour, and I think this works a treat for a dark oxidised metal chip. Having had my fill of sponge chipping, I moved on to some grime. For this I used the MIG Starship Filth Oil Brusher, thin lightly with universal weathering carrier. This was once again brushed in the rough areas I wanted to go, and then blended and streaked until I was happy with the effect. When streaking oils like this, there's always a lot of back and forth. I'll run through the process in a bit more detail now. To start with, it's best to use a brush that is either dry or very lightly soaked in oil thinner. You want to then brush the streak downwards, either side of the paint. And sometimes you'll need to do an upstroke just to make sure the streak is straight and tidy. And the nice thing about doing this with oils is if you're not happy, you can just wipe it away and start again. One thing that's imperative when streaking is to make sure the streaks are going absolutely vertical towards the bottom of the vehicle, especially on flat surfaces. Anyway, once I was happy with that, I used some Abteilung 502 sepia to just do a small pin wash around some of the details on the interior. Once again, this was thinned with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier. The brush I'm using here is an Artis Opus 20 Kolinsky Sable. The point on these is fantastic, so it's great for fine washes like this as well as detail painting. Once the painting and weathering on the interior was complete, it was time to close up the fighting compartment. These box style assemblies usually fill me with a little bit of dread, but luckily everything went together really nicely. With assemblies like this, it does take a moment just to make sure everything's lined up, but as long as you're careful, everything will go smoothly. And of course, always remember to scrape away any excess paint on the areas that are going to be glued together. And as you can see here, slow and steady definitely wins the race with assembling these constructions, especially when there's a camera in the way. To make sure the assembly dried nice and strong, it was taped before the roof pieces were added. The turret was built up in a multi-part assembly. You need to be really careful when gluing these parts together to make sure that outer surface is smooth and free of steps. And with that, it's time to move on to some more paintwork. The whole model was primed once again with Mr. Surfacer 1500, followed by a layer of SMS Dark Green G4. This was sprayed over the entire model before moving on to some highlights. For the first layer of highlights, I used some Dark Green G4 mixed with some CARC Green, both from SMS. This was built up in a light modulation style, focusing on the upper parts of panels and the upper flat surfaces. This highlight layer is heavily thinned. You're looking around 80% thinner to 20% paint. For the next highlight layer, my mixing got a bit more involved. To my previous mix of dark green G4 and CARC green, I added some SMS Trainer yellow and some MRP dark yellow. This was thinned once again around 80-20, and then sprayed in the areas where I wanted the more extreme highlights to go. Spraying fine areas like this is where my 0.15 hardness Steenbeck really starts to shine. Once the green of the paintwork was complete, I post-shaded with a mix of black and dark brown thinned to around 90% thinner. I'm not particularly happy with how this post-shade came out, and if you're unhappy with a post-shade, you can always mist over a thin layer of the base coat just to tone it down. Next up, I painted the turret markings. These were supplied as decals, but I figured painting them would be a bit easier. I started off, which you'll need either way, with a layer of white around the outside of the turret. The white I'm using here is SMS white, thinned with 60% Mr. Leveling Thinner. Next up, I added some zigzags with tape, which took ages to get correct, and painted on the Italian green. I'm not 100% sure what colours I used for this, because it took a lot of mixing to get right. None of my greens out of the bottle matched the colour properly, which was unfortunate, but I did get there in the end. For the red sections, I used SMS Italian red, slightly darkened with a touch of black. I thought I'd get away with my risky no masking tape gamble with this, but I did have to go over some of the green on the top just to tidy it up. And in the end, it wasn't a lot of effort for some nice painted on markings. Next up, I once again lazily free-handed the tyres on the wheels. This was mixed from black and a sandy colour. And needless to say, I had to make sure I didn't have a coffee before doing this, because getting jacked up with the caffeine shakes would have been tragic. The lamps on these armoured cars were usually brass, and because I still wasn't getting the SMS brass to spray nicely, I used Mr. Colour Super Metallic Gold. This was thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner, again around 70-30 thinner to paint. This was sprayed over 2 layers of paint to make it slightly brighter, Mr. Colour GX2 and then Alclad Chrome. There were only 3 decals to apply on this, aside from the turret ones which I didn't decide to use, and these were of excellent quality. I used VMS Decal Set and Fix to stick them in place nicely, and after that I didn't use any setting solution. The decals and paintwork were just sealed in with a layer of VMS matte varnish. Anyway, who's for chips? Not me, I've got some weathering to do. For the first stage of chipping on this model, I used Vallejo Stone Grey and Russian Uniform World War II. This was mixed to a light green grey, using a very fine sable brush and a road wheel for an example. I started adding some small chips and scratches to the entirety of the road wheel. For first stage chips, it's always ideal to use a slightly desaturated tone so as not to make them too glaring. And a green grey is perfect for a colour like this, because it's not too in your face. These chips were then infilled with my MVP of chipping colours at the moment, Chippernick CN04. This was painted in the centres of some of the light green grey chips. It can be helpful when chipping to use a paint retarder to slow down that drying time, and also a sable brush is really useful, because they hold quite a lot of paint and you can chip for quite a while before having to reload your brush. I really like chipping with chipping fluid, but it's really hard to get that 2-stage chipped effect with a chipping fluid. That's why for this model I defaulted to brush chipping. And talking about chipping fluid, a medium layer of the Humbrol chipping fluid was sprayed over the entire model. I then sprayed over a heavily thinned dust layer consisting of AK Real Colour 7027 Grey and 8020 Brown. I tend to chicken out when dusting a model like this, so for this one I decided to go whole hog. This dust mix was sprayed in areas where I thought the dust would build up the most. With older vehicles like this, you don't always get those juicy reference photos to give you an idea for weathering, so sometimes you do have to guesstimate a little bit and use your best judgment. Anyway, once this was dry, I used a slightly damp brush with warm water and brushed the dust away lightly in a downward motion. I don't know why I spoke so robotically then, but I'm just going to keep it in. Anyway, this technique gives you a nice base layer for further weathering effects. It just gives that first dust layer some irregularities that you wouldn't get when applying with a brush. Next up, I'm going to try some of these new pigment jockeys from VMS. I mixed up some light earth and sandy earth to match my sprayed dust colour, and this was then applied with a brush. Being an enamel or oil-based product, you can blend it in nicely. So don't worry too much if you get it in a place that isn't quite right. These new VMS products are kind of like a pigment weathering wash, and they come in a selection of earth and rust tones, which I'm looking forward to trying out on future projects. Anyway, once the first layer of these pigment jockeys was dry, I blended them in with a soft brush. I used a streaking motion to also get some kind of rain mark effects at the same time. And once that step was complete, I added some of that coarse sand that I used on the interior to the exterior surfaces. This time I just mixed it with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier and dabbed it on in areas where I wanted more volume to the sand and dust. My application here does look slapdash, but it will be blended in a moment. The blending process for heavier application of pigments is a little bit different, in that you'll find yourself removing quite a lot. So just remember to be light with your brush in areas where you want more pigment to remain. After this, the wheels were glued in place. I had to modify one of the bonnet or hood sides as it didn't come in a configuration that allowed the engine to be displayed. This was achieved with some careful cutting and thinning of the parts before they were glued in place. And what about machine guns, I hear you ask? Well, I've got that covered. These First World War Fiat machine guns were first sprayed with GX2, once again in the usual fashion. I then mixed up some Alclad steel with some SMS black, and this served as the base metallic colour for the guns. The cooling jackets were then masked and sprayed with the base colour. These were then carefully glued into place. Carefully, because if you don't take care when positioning these, you can have wonky looking machine guns. And nobody wants wonky looking machine guns. To finish off the model, the lenses for the lamps were glued in place. The glue I used for this was VMS Transperfix 6K. It's a fairly hard wearing clear glue that can be cleaned up with a universal weathering carrier, which is what I'm doing here. And with that, my friends, the build was complete. Before we get to the final reveal, I'd like to give a huge shout out and thanks to my patrons. Thank you so much for supporting my work, it means a lot to me. If you'd like to become a patron and support the channel, just head over to patreon.com/LPJmodels. Also, don't forget to subscribe, that really helps me out, and hit the like button or the dislike button if you didn't like the video. I'll leave you with the gallery images, please let me know what you think in the comments. I'm James from LPJ Models, thanks for watching.